it's Deepa from the Beaumont Library with your recommended read. Today I'll be reading an excerpt from The Plum Tree by Ellen Marie Wiseman with permission by Kensington Books. Germany. For 17-year-old Christine Bölz, the war began with a surprise invitation to the Bauerman's holiday party. On that brilliant fall day in 1938, it was impossible to imagine the horrors to come. The air was as crisp and sweet as the crimson apples hanging in the orchards that lined the gentle foothills of the Coca River Valley. The sun was shining in a blue September sky, quilted with tall cottony clouds that swept rolling shadows over the countryside. It was quiet in the hills, except for the scolding jays and scurrying squirrels as they gathered seeds and nuts for the coming winter. Wood smoke and the mossy scent of spruce intermingled to produce a smoldering, earthy aroma that, despite the fall chill in the air, gave the morning depth and texture. Due to a shortage of rain that year, the leaf-covered trails of the forests were dry, and Christine could have run along the steep, rocky sections without fear of slipping. Instead, she took Isaac Bauerman's hand and let him help her down the lichen-covered boulder, wondering what he'd think if he knew how much time she spent in the woods. Normally, she would have leapt off the side of Devil's Rock as if she were immortal, landing squarely on the slippery layers of pine needles and spongy earth, knees bent to keep from tumbling forward. But she didn't jump this time, because she didn't want him to think she was a lumbering tomboy who lacked class or manners or grace. Worse than that, she didn't want him to think that she didn't have the sense to realize that the legend about the boulder, that some boys playing hooky from church had once been struck and killed by lightning there, was nothing more than a spooky fable. He'd laughed when she told him, but after, as they gripped the boulder's cracks and fissures and moved down its ancient side, she wished she hadn't bored him with such a foolish childhood tale. "How did you know where she said. "I mean, how did you find? I looked in my father's desk for your wage records and got your address," he said. "I hope you don't mind that I invited myself over and joined you on your walk." She walked faster so he wouldn't see her smile. "It's all right with me," she said. It was more than all right with her. It meant that the hollow sensation she felt whenever they were apart had disappeared, for now at least. As soon as she'd woken up that day, she'd started counting the hours until she could go to her job at his house. After a breakfast of warm goat's milk and brown bread with plum jam, she had done her chores, then tried to read, but it was no use. She couldn't stay at home another minute. Instead of watching the clock, she decided to go into the hills to search for edelweiss and alpine roses for Oma and Opa's anniversary table. "But what would your parents think if they knew you were here?" she asked. "They wouldn't think anything," he said. He hurried ahead, then walked backwards in front of her, acting as if she were going to step on his toes and hopping out of the way just in time. He laughed and she smiled, mesmerized by his playful grin. She knew that Isaac spent hours reading and studying and could probably recite the Latin names for the strawberries and hazelnuts that grew wild along the grassy knolls. More than likely, he could identify each species of bird even in flight and the different animals that had left paw tracks in the soft earth. But his knowledge came from pictures and books, while hers came from observation and years of folklore. She'd spent her childhood exploring the rolling hills and black forests that surrounded their hometown of Jacinto. She was familiar with every winding trail and ancient tree, knew every cave and stream. What had begun as an early morning chore, collecting the edible mushrooms that her father had patiently taught her to identify, soon became her favorite pastime. She loved to escape the village, to walk along the edges of fields, cross the railroad tracks, and follow the rutted wagon trails until they tapered into narrow wooded paths. It was her time alone, time to let her thoughts roam free. She couldn't count the number of times she'd climbed to the 13th century cathedral ruins in the heart of the forest to daydream in the protected nest of soft grass formed by its 3 ancient crumbling walls. The flying buttresses lent no support, and the cathedral windows were empty now, serving as nothing more than stone frames for evergreen boughs, milky skies, or twinkling stars cradled in the white sickle of a quarter moon. But she often stood where she estimated the altar would have been, trying to imagine the lives of those who had prayed and married and cried beneath the church's soaring arches. Knights in shining armor and priests with long beards, baronesses roped in jewels, and ladies in waiting trailing behind. And that was an excerpt from The Plum Tree. I hope you check it out.